Well, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Oliver Harvey. I work at Deutsche Bank. For my sins, I'm currently responsible for Brexit research. It's definitely an interesting time to be a UK economist. I wish I'd watched more Game of Thrones. At least we have a leader of the opposition that does actually understand markets, in the sense that his comments regarding a potential run on the pound, I mean, that's quite sensible, because you price in all the bad news first and then you get elected and then the sterling rallies and then you're a hero. But on a serious note, I've been asked to give a presentation on Brexit. We've got half an hour. Doing Brexit in half an hour is going to be slightly tricky. So I'm going to restrict my comments just to something that interests me. I was asked just outside, how can you sort of be a Brexit expert when Brexit hasn't happened, which is a very good question. There is one aspect of Brexit that I think is happening now, which you might find interesting, and then hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So if you want to talk to me about something else or want to ask a question on some other aspect of it, I'm happy to try to do so. I wanted to talk about the labour market in Brexit, because politically, Brexit was seen really as a vote against a significant section of society losing out in the labour market, and it's probably encapsulated by this chart here, which is real wage growth since the financial crisis. I've indexed it to 2008. And you can see, and you're probably all aware of this already, the UK's had one of the worst wage performances of any economy globally since the financial crisis. The only country that's worse than the UK in terms of wage performance, or real wage performance, but nominal wages, it would be equally true as the United Kingdom, is Greece. And if you measure it relative to past recoveries as well, the UK's earnings performance has been extremely bad. The fact that real wages are still not above their level in 2008. So for a large section of society, they've lost out from, have lost out, or feel they've lost out in terms of earnings. And that was one of the reasons for Brexit. But this is puzzling because the labour market's performed very well in lots of other ways since the financial crisis. This is a chart of the unemployment rate, which you might know is at a record low. And this is also another chart, which is part-time workers, percentage that could not find a job. So a lot of people saying one of the reasons for weak wage growth is because there's actually still a lot of slack left in the labour market that you can't really see because of informal economy, or people want to work more hours. Well, this is part-time workers that could not find, the reason they're part-time workers, they couldn't find a full-time job. That rate is still well above mid-2000s levels, but it has been coming down a lot. So this has led people to speculate that the relationship between employment, or the relationship between demand, and the relationship between prices, or the relationship between wages, has broken down. You might have heard of a concept called the Phillips curve. Well, this is a chart of the Phillips curve in the UK, but I've broken it down into some discrete periods, and you can see that there used to be quite a strong relationship in the 1970s and the 1980s between the unemployment rate and average weekly earnings, and that seems to have flattened. And so some people have been speculating that there has been this fundamental breakdown in the relationship. The Bank of England have been talking about this breakdown in the relationship. It would have extremely important consequences for monetary policy, of course, because if you can't influence prices via demand anymore, then you have to reconfigure your whole way of thinking about monetary policy. But people have speculated that the reason that the Phillips curve has broken down is because workers have basically lost out to capital. Labour has lost out to capital, and companies have become, the bargaining power of workers become much, much less. If you look at the percentage of the population that's a member of a union today versus the 1970s, much, much lower. Frequency of strikes is much, much lower. So this idea that somehow wages have lost out to capital. But I disagree with this, and the reason I disagree with it is very simple. If you adjust wage growth in the UK since the financial crisis for productivity, you actually find that the relationship between employment, the relationship between demand, and the relationship between prices reestablishes itself pretty clearly. So this chart here is basically removing, or rather adding in, a productivity element to the Phillips curve. It's unit labour costs. So it's the amount that labour costs per unit of output versus the unemployment rate. And you can see actually that that relationship remains very, very strong. And the reason that real wage growth has been exceptionally weak in the UK, I would argue, is not primarily because labour has lost out to capital. It's a function of extremely weak productivity growth. And on the chart on the left-hand side, I won't go through all the charts, but on the chart on the left-hand side, what I've done is I've broken down the sort of productivity gap, the underperformance of the UK's productivity growth by sector versus earnings growth. And you can see there's a very clear relationship. If you look at industries like mining and quarrying, unfortunately financial services, a lot less productive than we were before 2008. There's a very, very clear relationship with the gap of earnings pre-crisis. So my argument would be that productivity explains most of the UK's disappointing wage performance since the financial crisis. Why am I telling you all of this, and what does it have to do with Brexit? You might be legitimately asking. I'm telling you because what we're seeing at the moment is the UK transitioning towards a massive labour supply shock, and it's already happening. And to go back to my point right at the beginning, which is that Brexit was seen as a vote against disappointing wage growth for a large section of the population, one of the arguments is the reason it's been disappointing is because you've had a big influx of migration and a large amount of foreign labour pricing themselves into the labour market. And that therefore, by restricting supply of foreign labour, by tightening immigration policy, you might be able to lift wage growth, and therefore people might feel a bit happier and the political problems we've seen might dissipate. This is already happening. The chart on the left-hand side shows you net migration into the United Kingdom in the thousands versus the employment growth of EU-born workers. We haven't had Brexit yet, but 18 months ago, on a cumulative, 12-month cumulative basis, there were 300,000 jobs going to EU-born workers. Today it's 40,000. It's a massive collapse in, well, as you can see, it leads net migration, so the net migration figures are falling as well. But it's a massive collapse in employment growth for foreign-born workers. And the chart on the right-hand side shows you that this is going to be really problematic because this splits up employment growth between foreign-born and UK-born citizens. And you can see that over the last decade, it's cumulative, over the last decade, much of the jobs growth, over 50% of the jobs growth, all the jobs growth in the UK has gone to foreign-born workers. Not because they're pricing themselves into jobs, because the domestic unemployment rate and the domestic participation rate, so native-born people, if you want to use that terminology, is at a record high. In a sense, what has happened is the UK's demographics look quite bad, and these foreign-born workers have come in and papered over some very weak demographic trends. And there simply isn't enough working-age population growth in the United Kingdom to sustain the employment growth that we've seen recently. And I can talk about that in a little bit more detail, but how does this relate to what I was talking about at the beginning? Because we've already said that productivity explains most of the weakness in earnings growth, and it's nothing to do with a breakdown in the relationship between labour and capital. You can see that, the chart on the left-hand side. In the US, you can make the case that capital has won in the last decade versus labour, because the labour share of income in the US has collapsed. So what may be motivating Trumpian voters to protest against the status quo, you might argue there was, corporations becoming relatively more powerful in their bargaining power. But it hasn't happened in the UK. And just to reinforce the point, the chart on the right-hand side shows output per hour versus total compensation. The two attract each other absolutely perfectly. So workers haven't lost out, even though you've had this big influx of migration. And there's not that much evidence to suggest that migrants have been pricing themselves into less well-paying jobs. But what happens next? And you might wonder why I've given this big preamble, but what happens next? This argument of productivity is really, really important to understand what happens when we get this very, very big labour supply shock that's already happening. Because if you're a company that is faced with suddenly big shortages of labour, you basically have the simple argument is essentially if labour supply is much lower, if there are less workers, but there's a set equivalent amount of demand, then workers are going to be able to bid up their prices, and companies will have to be forced to pay workers more. But this argument is too simple because it misses something else that has happened to the UK economy, which is absolutely fundamental to Brexit and what the consequences of Brexit will be. And this is a massive opening out of the UK economy over the last 20 years. And the simple way of showing this is trade as a share of GDP. This is imports as a share of GDP, or as a share of domestic demand. That's import penetration, which is a slightly different way of calculating it, has massively increased in the last 2.5 decades. And why does that matter, and what does it have to do with the productivity story? It matters because the simple argument, which is that smaller labour force will mean more bargaining power for wages, breaks down when you have a globalised economy. Because domestic producers are not price makers, they're price takers. And if you're a company that is either exporting to the rest of the world or face stiff competition from foreign importers, and we've already seen how actually your profit margins aren't necessarily that much higher than they were 2 decades ago because the labour share of income has held up quite well in the UK, you can't just accept big increases in your labour costs because they will eat into your margins. And you can't raise prices because you're setting prices in a globalised economy. So for the tradable sector of the UK, the effect of this big labour supply shock will be one of 3 things. Either companies will go out of business, which I hope doesn't happen, or they will offshore production because labour costs are too expensive in the United Kingdom, or, and this is the most optimistic outcome, they will automate. The UK currently has the lowest robots per manufacturing worker of any country in the OECD. So people talk about the the automation revolution, about changing the labour force. My point would be this hasn't happened yet in the UK, but it very, very much might happen because of Brexit. I will add one coda to this analysis. Oh, that's the robot density. Korea is very good at robots, Singapore's good at robots, Japan's good at robots, Germany is good at robots, UK is not so good at robots. I will add one coda to this analysis, which is that I've talked about how, because wages fundamentally are linked to productivity, was the only sustainable way of raising wages is actually producing productivity growth. And there's no way to artificially raise wages if you're a tradables company in a globalized economy, which is what the UK is at the moment, without generating productivity growth. There is one coda to that, which is that there are industries in the UK which are not exposed to international competition, they're not exposed to foreign competition. And economics, we would typically call these non-tradables industries. So the classic example used by an economist would be a hairdresser. It's very unlikely a hairdresser would be exposed to foreign, that's not a fungible service that can be provided. So these companies are not exposed. So these companies have pricing power. And therefore they can raise prices in response to a labour supply shock. So if you're a hairdresser and you suddenly find that you have a shortage of labour because immigration has collapsed, you can actually raise your prices and you can afford to pay people more because you're not exposed, you're not in that globalised economy. So what will happen is, this chart here shows you the percentage of foreign workers in industry on the x-axis versus the number of vacancies on the y-axis. So basically, y-axis is employment demand as of today, which sectors have the most employment demand at the moment, versus the percentage of foreign workers in industry. So obviously a very clear positive relationship. But what's interesting is, of the sectors that have both a high percentage of foreign workers and a very large number of vacancies, basically these are the hairdressing sectors. So wholesale, retail, repair of vehicles, that's retail trade. Health and social work, that's things like care homes, nurses. Accommodation, food, services, that's the hospitality industry. among other things. So these are the non-tradable sectors. So actually these non-tradable sectors where you can raise prices if you have a big labour shortage are the most exposed to this big collapse in labour supply. So what does this mean? And I'm going to come to the kind of conclusion. It basically means that if you look at the economy in the UK in response to this labour supply shock, you can think of it as two separate things. What happens in the tradable sector, where you can't raise prices because fundamentally labour has to be related to productivity in a globalised world, and the non-tradable sectors, your hairdressers, mainly the tradable sectors, widget makers, I'm not sure, non-tradable sectors, which is hairdressers, where you can raise prices because you don't have that competition. So relative wages will rise in non-tradable sectors, such as care homes, accommodation, food services, wholesale, retail trade, at the expense of the tradable sectors, such as manufacturing. And that will basically divert resources in the economy into those non-tradable sectors, which themselves are systemically less productive than the tradable sectors. I'm not casting any aspersions on the brilliance of our hospitality industry, but fundamentally productivity growth is much, much weaker in sectors like hospitality, in sectors like care homes, than it is in sectors like manufacturing. So what the supply shock will do is reinforce the negative productivity story that we've seen over the last 10 years, and actually make it even more difficult, at least in those sectors like manufacturing, to, well, maybe make it more difficult in the economy as a whole to get real wages up. But the point is, for those other sectors, the non-tradable sectors, because they can raise their prices, the impact will be very inflationary. So you will begin to start to see wages pick up in these sectors. And to bring this to a conclusion, the Bank of England are now about to hike interest rates in November. That's now our official call. And this has confused quite a lot of people because they've said, why is the Bank of England about to hike rates in the middle of Brexit negotiations when demand is clearly slowing? H1 GDP growth in the first half of this year was significantly weaker than it was in the second half of last year. Why is this happening? And this is basically the reason. Is because this supply shock is happening now. And in sectors like retail, health, accommodation and food, they will be very, very vulnerable to a big contraction of their labour supply. And they will be able to raise prices because they are not exposed to foreign competition. And they will be able to raise wages to attract workers towards them, away from the less productive sectors. And it's this concern about inflation that is leading the Bank of England to hike interest rates. So I appreciate that's a lot to think about. If anyone has any disagreements or questions, very happy to talk to those. Equally, if you would like me to talk about anything else to do with Brexit that's not related to this, specifically whether it's the politics or other aspects of the negotiations, feel free and I'll try and answer your question. But thank you very much. Up there.
Yeah, at the moment there is an exception list as an employer where there is in short supply like technology. Do you see that expanding, for example, into the restaurant area and other areas where they will allow people to come in much easier from Europe, because that already applies to non-EU. It's ready to bring people in like technology, people from outside the EU. Do you see that list? I think it's about 10 pages, expanding to maybe 100 pages, where they'll be bringing in people all over the place where they perceive shortages.
Yeah, I think it has to happen, and it will happen. Basically, you have a sectoral approach to migration. Another thing that's been floated, which I think is a very interesting idea, is because, and we haven't talked about the politics of the migration issue, but a lot of the resentment against migration is this feeling people don't have control over the numbers, and therefore something else that's been talked about is like a regional immigration policy. So basically regions, if they're facing big labour shortages, I mean London would be a classic example, would be able to basically take in more workers. So they absolutely have to do that. And demographically, I mean, I'm talking about this not, I talked a bit about sectors, but in the economy as a whole, one of the big problems with this is that if you look at the demographics, I didn't have time to go into much detail, the UK looks quite like Japan if you take out migration. Our demographics are very, very weak because we're basically seeing the retirement of the whole baby boomer generation. And the working age population as a share of total population is in pretty precipitous decline. So absolutely, immigration policy has, we just have to have the people. The problem, and some people might see it as the irony, is that even if government policy is much more active and much more pro-migration, and there's less of this anti-migration rhetoric, there are structural reasons why migration is slowing anyway. The main reason is the Eurozone is recovering. So what has pushed the last big wave of net migration into the UK, and there were three big waves. One was the abolition of tuition fees in '97. The second was the accession of the A10 countries in 2003. The last one was the Eurozone crisis, where basically very, very high unemployment rates, particularly youth unemployment rates, pushed all these people to the United Kingdom. As the Eurozone recovers, that net migration is going to slow anyway, kind of thing. So, but to your question, yeah, absolutely, it has to be. I think we have to have a much more realistic. Policymakers have to make that argument a lot better, because I think migration will be just as important as trade in terms of the long-term growth potential of the economy. So,
do you think that Brexit is the biggest risk to the UK economy?
I would say yes. I think the main, from our point of view, we argued fairly soon after the referendum that what needed to happen was a transitional deal modelled on the European Economic Area of up to 4 to 5 years. Subsequent to that, we have kind of now moved, the public debate has now moved towards the recognition of a transitional deal and the importance of that, although probably 2 years is not long enough in order to get everything prepared for. In terms of the near-term economic outlook, I would say it absolutely is the biggest risk, although there are other risks. For me, I think the question now, given the debate has moved to this transitional deal, is the timing of it. I'd be very interested to hear what everyone else thinks. From my perspective, there's a big difference between agreeing it in Q1 next year, or around about the turn of the year, and agreeing it right at the deadline date, October next year, with just enough time for the European Parliament to sign off on it. Because a lot of companies, and again, I'd be interested to hear your views, particularly in the city, are not going to wait until Q3, Q4 next year, even if it looks like things might be moving in that direction, as long as there is a risk. If we don't have a political commitment in Q1, I think you will see a bandwagon effect start to accelerate. So I do think it is the biggest risk. It's not the only one.
So can I slightly rephrase that? If you had a situation where Jeremy Corbyn was in power and Brexit wasn't going through, would that be worse than a situation where Brexit happens and Jeremy Corbyn is in?
I'm very careful about this. Politically, what's interesting is that it's very difficult, and I'm making absolutely no judgments one way or another, it's very difficult for the Labour Party to win an absolute majority. And the reason is that the way that the parliamentary constituencies are divvied up mean that the hurdle in terms of the share of the popular vote for them to actually have a majority, for Corbyn to have a majority if there was an early election, which is a big if, is actually very, very high. So the most likely outcome actually is that Labour would be the largest party, but they wouldn't have a majority. And then it would be a question as to what extent would Labour be willing to do what the Conservatives did in 2010 and come up with a coalition agreement or a confidence to supply with Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Nationalist Party. If that was the case, if they did do that, then they would, maybe some of the more radical left-wing policies would perhaps be watered down. I think the other outcome would be 100%, the condition of that from the Liberal Democrats and the SNP would be a second referendum. So in a way, maybe you could paint that as a bullish scenario, actually. I mean, I think people might be concerned if you do have a former communist as as Chancellor. Well, quite. But I wonder to what extent, if they don't get a majority, I think it will either be very difficult for them to govern if they don't have a formal agreement, because the other parties will try and block a lot of the more radical elements of the agenda. And if they have a coalition agreement, then I can see some of that agenda being watered down, which is a long way of not answering your question. Gentlemen.
Yeah, you mentioned that obviously nobody knows what Brexit is yet, so we're still in a bit of uncertainty, which might last a while. Nobody knows yet, actually. So do you foresee, or do you see already whole sectors or whole industries making hypotheses and preparing for whatever they think Brexit is? In particular, do you see a trend in the financial industry regarding euro clearing and things like that, where companies would be moving? And in that line of thought, since you work for Deutsche Bank, what's Deutsche Bank's perspective on this? Are you preparing anything?
Yeah, so Deutsche Bank's perspective, and these are all public comments made by a CEO, so I'm not going to get into trouble. I mean, we're preparing, quote unquote, we're preparing for all eventualities, which is another way of saying that, if there isn't a transitional agreement that is struck, we're prepared for that as well. And in terms of a lot of the conversations I have in the city in particular, people are preparing for the kind of worst case outcome, because they have to. And I think those plans are in place, but nobody is willing, but people will give a little bit more time, a little bit more benefit of the doubt in the negotiations. I think if you don't get agreement in the first quarter of next year, and things are just dragging on until the last possible minute, plans that, and I'm speaking of the city as a whole here rather than Deutsche Bank, people's plans will, the plans that have already been drawn up will be put into practice, if that makes sense, to prepare for a potential loss of, a potential hard Brexit, quote unquote. Lately over
The question is very much related, whether or not there will be lots of passporting for the financial services industry, and when it will become apparent to us.
I think the debate has moved on from passporting. I think initially there were some people who were holding out hopes that passporting would be, if we remain in the European Economic Area, maybe if we have a transitional deal for 2 years, we can retain passporting for 2 years. But from a longer term perspective, I think the debate has moved, firstly it moved away from passporting, then it looked at equivalence, and then it decided that equivalence wasn't actually very good either, because there's so much uncertainty about whether, if you take the latest Commission paper on clearing, you just give ESMA the authority to say, from one day to the next, whether, we like your clearing houses or not, which is exactly the same principle the European Commission already has over other elements of equivalence. So I think the debate has just moved, it's moved on from there. I think maybe people are holding out for a very deep a Canada with a lot more for financial services. But I'm fairly pessimistic about that, unless the UK was just to say outright, we're joining the European Economic Area, which I don't think is politically possible, because I think the EU will be extremely resistant to a regulatory arbitrage type approach. And actually they will say, we have our existing models. If you want to be a member of the EEA, you can keep passporting. If not, I'm afraid, even equivalence is going to be very, very tricky. So that's just purely my personal opinion. That's not necessarily a Deutsche Bank opinion. My opinion is it seems like the industry, the debate has moved from passporting, and then it was equivalence might do, and then it's like, actually equivalence is not going to work either. We're going to plan for being a third country, essentially. Conscious of time, so how many? One more. Gentlemen.
Found your analysis really good, interesting. The chart you showed before this was quite interesting actually, just to see, the sectors which will be more driving the inflation, the non-tradable. Now the question is, have you shared this chart with the policymakers to understand where the investment should go in the country? Let's say the Brexit goes through, to the non-tradables or the tradables, because we certainly want to be coordination of
Well, that would imply I have any kind of influence with policymakers, which is an incorrect assumption. But thank you for the kind words. I was at a dinner on Thursday last week with the British Hospitality Association. So this is precisely the sector that will be affected, and they were all sort of CFOs or CEOs of restaurant companies essentially, and they were telling me that we've been trying to get the message across for the last 12 months to the government on this point, and that they were really already, I mean, it affects different companies in different ways, so I don't want to be blanket, but for some of them it was already really having a big impact. Basically, they couldn't find the workers, and they were having to come up with innovative solutions in terms of basically giving people 2 jobs and things like that.
On one side is the problem that finding the workers, the other problem is that the incentive for the native population would be to go towards high-paying jobs, and what happens to them? The areas which can actually increase the productivity and increase the competitiveness of the UK in the world, which is going into the other sectors, which will demand more investment from the policy.
Somehow you have to increase the incentives. So you have to level the playing field in another way, whether that's through tax policy, whether that's through we have less state aid rules outside the EU. Maybe you can do something innovative with that. There have been some suggestions, but you absolutely have to, on a relative basis, try to fix that problem. I was going to make one final point on that. It was there was an interesting chart. So, just a final point on this. So they actually have to fix that. There was an interesting chart by Andrew Haldane, who's the Bank of England's chief economist. He basically does big paper into the productivity story. I mean, he's a really formidable economist, well worth reading his speeches because you can also understand they're not too technically written. Basically, one of the conclusions he had was that in the sectors that were either foreign owned or exposed to foreign competition, the structurally higher productivity, and so output per hour was higher, and also productivity growth was much, much higher. So we absolutely have to continue to be, I mean, we've had a lot of inward investment over the last 10 years, or at least since 2010 when we've lowered the corporation tax. We have to keep that, and we have to make the playing field, we have to level the playing field. I don't know what the answer is, but thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of the conference.